Our God is a generous God. He shares almost everything with us. He shares his resources with us. He shares his kingdom with us. He shared his son with us. There's one thing God will not share with us, and that is his glory. He will not share his glory with us. So many athletes, when they do well, they like to point to heaven. What are they trying to do? They're trying to communicate it's not about them. They want God to get the glory. We always see somebody criticize that. What? Did God give them a touchdown? Did God give them a home run? That's not the point. They're trying in their life to make sure that they always give him the glory. That's our job as well, too. There's an old hymn. It's my all-time favorite hymn. To God be the glory. Great things he has done. Great things he has done. Today we start this series in the life of Moses. Here's the interesting thing about Moses is that he's known by one name. He's one of the one-namers in our world. Anytime I talk about Moses, none of you ever go, Moses who? It's just we know. We know him by one name. The name Noah, the name Jesus, all known by one name. There's other one-namers out there today. Beyonce, Bono, Oprah, Pink, Tiger, Usher, Trump. Just all known by just one name in this world. And Moses had the privilege of being one of those one-namers. Now, if you were here with us last summer we went through the life of David, and we were looking at what does it mean to become a person after God's own heart. What does it mean to have this amazing heart for God? This summer, though, we're going to go through the life of Moses, and we're looking, what does it mean to be a person who wants God's glory in their life? They want God to get the glory. What has happened in your life where you've ever stopped and just stood in awe, a moment maybe when words failed you? That's what it means to give somebody glory. You're in such a sense of awe of someone. They're so huge in your life that you can't even put words together sometimes. Maybe that moment happened at the birth of a child. Maybe it happened when you stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon or saw the ocean for the first time. I know I was nearly speechless when I saw the Northern Lights for the first time, full on. I mean, I just wagged my head. Words just completely failed me. When you're standing in the awe of God's glory, it's so impactful. Tim Keller, when he describes the glory of God, he describes it as the weightiest thing you can possibly imagine. It's such a huge weight that lands in your life that it causes all of your life to be reoriented around that. Like a boulder. Let's say a boulder comes rolling down a mountain and it lands in a stream. The boulder has more glory than the water does. And so when the boulder hits the water, suddenly the water is responsible for reorienting its life. The water has to bend, not the boulder. Same thing happens when God lands in our life full on. It's not our life that asks God to reorient. It's you and I reorienting our thought process around him now. And there's the hard part for so much of this world. There's the hard part even for some Christians when we're talking about certain social issues. Well, I know what God said, but I think I'm going to go in a different path. And we ask God to bend to us rather than allowing that weight to land on us and you and I being crushed. We're crushed by the weightiness of who God is. In a sense, then, that's how the Bible talks about glory. When the boulder of that lands in the stream of my life, I reorient it around him. One of the things that the Bible teaches us in the Old Testament over and over again is you better keep your hands off God's glory. You better keep your hands off his glory. This is something Moses is going to learn over time, and we're going to be a part of learning that. It's something Pharaoh, even though he's warned over and over again, will ignore the lesson. Pharaoh in this story thinks he deserves all the glory. And the day's going to come, Moses says to Pharaoh, when you will fall to your knees and you will beg me to take what I've asked for. And that's exactly how this story ends. In the little background here before we begin this series, in the New Testament, the main event, of course, in the New Testament is the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. The main event in the Old Testament, though, is the exodus of God's people from slavery. That becomes this main event that carries all the way through the Old Testament. Genesis is the first book of the Bible. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. Genesis is a book about beginnings. Exodus is a book about redemption. Genesis ends with a coffin, the death of Joseph. That's how Genesis ends. Exodus begins, though, with a birth, the birth of Moses. You can, when you turn the page from Genesis to Exodus, you just crossed over 300 years worth of time. And everything is suddenly different. Ron, why would we even study the Old Testament? Aren't we New Testament people? Yes, we're New Testament people. I understand that, but it's going back into the Old Testament. We understand how the New Testament works, and we get a full-on glimpse of God's glory, which will be revealed in Jesus later. Now, just like every hero, comic book hero has an origin story, Moses has an origin story. If you follow comic book movies at all, you know there's an origin story. Batman's parents die, and then he uses all his financial resources to fight crime. Superman's planet is destroyed, and when he's sent to Earth, he has superpowers. Spider-Man is a teenager when he's bit by a radioactive spider, and he becomes Spider-Man. Ron Otto began as a Mennonite. Now he's a preacher in Lincoln. See, every hero. Do you see what I just failed this whole glory thing right there in that moment? Moses' origin story is a little different. To understand his starting story, we do have to back up a little bit into the story of Joseph. We got to go back into the end of Genesis. Joseph knows he's set aside for something amazing. He makes a mistake of telling his brothers that. They capture him. They pretend he's killed. They sell him into slavery. Joseph ends up being taken to Egypt, where he eventually becomes second in command of all of Egypt. Second in command. He saves the known world at that time from a great famine. After that, Pharaoh says, you know what? Anything you want, you have. And he says, I'd like to have my family close again. And Joseph makes the mistake, not knowing it, but he brings his whole clan, all of his brothers, all their families, his dad, to him. And they then start living in Egypt. The problem is they start multiplying, and they multiply and multiply. They're very, very fruitful. And the day comes when they outnumber the Egyptians. And after Joseph dies, everything changes in Egypt. We pick it up in Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. Now Joseph and his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Yeah, these new pharaohs, they did not remember Joseph. And so they captured the Hebrews. They forced them into slavery. And now here's the Israelites for 300 years who have been serving the Egyptians. And it's been brutal. They're still multiplying, by the way. They're still growing in such a number that the Pharaoh begins to worry. You know what? If we're ever faced with an enemy, our slaves may join the enemy and fight against us, and they're more numerous than us. And the Pharaoh comes up with a very sick idea. He wants all the male children, when they're born, destroyed. He wants them taken down and thrown into the Nile. Verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, when you are helping a Hebrew woman during childbirth, if you see that baby as a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God. They feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They feared God. These midwives, even back then, believed in the sanctity of life. There's no law yet. Moses has not brought down the law of God yet for mankind, but something deep inside these women knew that it was wrong to kill babies. So they disobeyed the government. And they broke the laws that were contrary to what God would have wanted. Well, Moses is born right in this time, and Moses' mother cannot bring herself to kill her child. She tries to keep him. 1 month goes by, 2 months, 3 months go by, and then he becomes too much to hide anymore. She does something pretty amazing. She takes him down to the Nile like she was told to do, but instead of just throwing him away, she puts him in a basket that she made. And I think very purposefully, she sent him down the Nile in the basket right in front of Pharaoh's daughter. If there's any hope at all for this little guy, it will be an Egyptian princess who has to rescue him. Oh my goodness, it's the most amazing story when you see it. In Hebrews chapter 11, we're told by faith, it was by their faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months, but after he was born, because they saw that he was no ordinary child, they kept him not afraid of the king's edict. And so they put him in a basket, floats him down the Nile. I believe the bathing habits of the ancient Egyptians were probably well known to the Hebrews. They saw the Nile as a sacred river, and to go down there for ceremonial cleansing and bathing is something they did regularly, and I think everyone in that community knew when it was a princess's day to go down. I think the mother of Moses knew exactly what she was doing. So she floated him down, and the princess, she takes one look at this little Hebrew baby and her heart melts. And she adopts Moses. Isn't this curious that even Pharaoh's own daughter disobeyed his decree? Even then, something tells us that this isn't right, what the Pharaoh asked for. Moses then grows up in the palace. He's treated as an Egyptian prince. He received the best education Egypt could afford. Hieroglyphics 101, mastered it. Mummy making, nailed it. Taught how to walk like an Egyptian. If you're watching online, I'm just waiting for the laughter to die down is what I'm waiting for. Moses, he's going to go on to do some amazing things, but somewhere in his early days, he's aware that he's a Hebrew. He's raised as an Egyptian prince, but he's aware that he's a Hebrew, and knowing his true nationality, it changed the way he saw the world around him. He will still go on to shipwreck his life. He'll still go on to make a colossal mistake and murder someone. He's going to make a wreck of everything. But Moses must have known even at that time that he might have been called to be some kind of a deliverer for his Hebrew nationality. He saw himself as the perfect person between Egypt and the Hebrews, and maybe he could make some kind of difference. The problem is Moses goes into this early on his own strength, and he's not using God's strength. He goes on his own glory and not about God's glory. And that's why that whole first part of his story does not work out. Moses' story is not so much a story about Moses, by the way. It's a story about what God's glory looks like in our lives. Now, Moses, he's going to eventually go on to become a great leader. He's going to go on to become a humble man, very obedient to God. And you need to know that leading the Israelites was not easy calling. It was very difficult. They even made it difficult. They complained about Moses over and over and over again. They complained to Moses. It happens so often that 5 different times God himself will come to Moses and say, just say the word, Moses, and I'll wipe those complainers out. Just say it, and poof, they'll be gone. God knows better than to make me that offer. God is looking out for some of you. That's all I'm going to say. And Moses' response to God is really quite amazing. I think God knew what his response would be, but God says, no, don't do that. That would only damage your glory. that would make you look bad. So let's not go down that path. One time, Moses is with God, and they're having conversation, and Moses asks this most amazing question. He says, God, show me all your glory. Show me your full glory. God thought that was cute. He says, Moses, if I showed you everything I am, poof, you'd be gone. It's too much for you to handle. It's like a father who's wrestling with his young son. His young son wants to wrestle with his dad. That dad knows he has to pull back on some of his strength. That dad knows he has to pull back because he could annihilate the son. He could just crush the son. And so the dad, in order to interact with his son, pulls back on some of his strength. That's exactly what God had to do in this moment when Moses said, show me your glory. He said, I'll show you just my back. And even then, that changed Moses. It may have even changed his appearance from that point on. Moses is going to eventually have to go back to Egypt, even though he runs from Egypt for a long time. He's going to have to stand before the most powerful leader in the world at that time. Moses sees himself as a nobody. Pharaoh sees himself as a somebody. But Moses is not going to come the second time in his own glory. He's going to come in God's glory. And nobody at the end of the story ever says, wow, look how powerful Moses was. Isn't it interesting when you get to the end of the book of Exodus, we all wag our heads and say, look how powerful God is. He gets the glory in all of this. That needs to be true of us as well. When reading about Bible characters, it's not as much about the story, it's the glory behind the story. And that's our story. It's not supposed to be about me, it's supposed to be about the glory of God behind me. And so it's going to beg a question this summer for you and I. I'm going to remind you of it over and over again. Start your day with asking the question, what can I do today to give God the glory in my life? And I wonder what's going to happen. By the way, when we do hit the New Testament, because we are New Testament people, the weightiest thing we know is the glory of Jesus Christ. He becomes the boulder that lands in our life. He's at the transfiguration of Jesus. He is changed into his glory in front of 3 disciples, and they can't even look at him. He's brighter than the sun. They fall on their face. They're shaking in fear in that moment of seeing him transfigured before them. Later on, the Apostle John, who was there at that moment, in John chapter 1, he will write these words, "The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Hebrews chapter 1 says this about Jesus, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being." When Jesus landed in my life, I did not ask him to reorient himself around me. I now have to learn to reorient myself around him. I'm reshaped by him landing in my life. And now my job is to make sure he gets the glory, not myself. So each day we're going to ask ourselves, how can I give God the glory today? Man, this is really going to be a good summer for us.